My name is Jeanette, 32 years old, and I'm sitting here in my bridal suite staring at the champagne glass my sister Lauren just handed me. The room is spinning slightly, which is strange because I only took a few sips. My wedding starts in 2 hours. 300 guests are already arriving downstairs, and I just realized something is terribly wrong with this drink. But instead of panicking, I'm going to let my sister think she won. Because sometimes the best revenge is letting someone destroy themselves in front of everyone who matters. Before I tell you how I handled the most shocking betrayal of my life, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever dealt with toxic family members at important events, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about standing up to people who try to tear us down. Let's dive into how one glass of champagne changed everything. Daniel proposed to me on a foggy morning at Baker Beach in San Francisco, with the Golden Gate Bridge emerging through the mist like something from a dream. We'd been together for 5 years, meeting at a tech conference where he was presenting on sustainable architecture, and I was there representing my marketing firm. It wasn't love at first sight, more like recognition at first conversation. We talked for 6 hours straight that first night, closing down the hotel bar, and then walking the empty streets until sunrise. When he got down on one knee with his grandmother's Art Deco ring, I didn't just see a proposal. I saw our whole future stretching out before us. Planning an $80,000 wedding sounds excessive until you break down the costs in the Bay Area. The venue alone at the Fairmont Hotel was $25,000. We wanted the crown room with its panoramic city views and original 1920s architecture. The catering came to another $20,000 for 300 guests, and that was with choosing the middle-tier menu. My dress, which I'd fallen in love with at a boutique in Union Square, cost $8,000. It was a Monique Lhuillier creation, with hand-sewn pearls cascading down the bodice, and a train that seemed to float behind me like morning mist. The flowers were another $10,000. The photographer and videographer team cost $7,000, and the 12-piece band we'd booked was $8,000. The remaining costs went to invitations, wedding favors, transportation, and the dozens of small details that somehow add up to real money. Our guest list read like a map of our lives. Daniel's family was flying in from Boston, bringing that East Coast formality that always made me slightly nervous. My relatives were coming from all over California, Texas, and Florida. We had college friends flying in from New York, London, and Tokyo. Daniel's architecture firm partners were attending, along with my entire marketing team. It was going to be the kind of wedding people remember, where cultures blend and stories are born. Lauren is 6 years older than me, which meant she got to be the pioneer in everything, while I got to be the baby who supposedly had it easy. She was valedictorian of her high school, and I was salutatorian of mine. She went to Berkeley for undergrad, and I went to Stanford. She became a corporate lawyer, and I became a creative director. On paper, we were both successful, but Lauren kept score in a way that turned achievements into weapons. When I got promoted at 28, she reminded me she'd made partner at 27. When I bought my condo in Pacific Heights, she pointed out her house in Marin was worth twice as much. Everything was a competition I didn't know I was entering. The divorce changed her. Lauren had married Richard when she was 32, a hedge fund manager who looked perfect at charity galas, but apparently had a secret apartment in the city for his 23-year-old assistant. The divorce was brutal, public, and expensive. Lauren kept the house, but lost something else in the process. The sharp edges that had always been part of her personality became serrated, designed to cut deeper. She started drinking wine at family dinners like it was water, making increasingly pointed comments about how lucky some people were to find loyal partners. When I announced my engagement at our parents' anniversary dinner, Lauren's face went through a transformation I'll never forget. First came surprise, then something that looked like pain, and finally settling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hugged me and said all the right words, but her fingers dug into my shoulders a little too hard, held on a little too long. Mom pulled me aside later and suggested I ask Lauren to be my maid of honor. Family needs to support family, she said, especially now that Lauren's having such a hard time. I should have trusted my instincts. Lauren threw herself into wedding planning with an enthusiasm that felt more like invasion. She had opinions about everything. The flowers were too traditional. The band was too expensive. The venue was trying too hard. She'd show up to vendor meetings, I hadn't invited her to questioning contracts, and suggesting alternatives that were invariably worse. When I chose my bridesmaids' dresses in a soft rose gold, she said the color would wash everyone out in photos. When I selected the menu, she reminded me that several guests might not appreciate such adventurous choices. Every decision I made came with commentary designed to plant seeds of doubt. 3 weeks before the wedding, things escalated. Lauren called to say she'd been thinking about the ceremony, and maybe I should reconsider having our cousin Emma do a reading since her public speaking skills were questionable. When I said Emma was already confirmed, Lauren sighed and said she was just trying to help me avoid embarrassment. The next day, she texted about the photographer, wondering if I'd really researched their portfolio enough, because some of their outdoor shots looked overexposed. When I didn't respond immediately, she sent follow-up messages about how she was only looking out for me because that's what big sisters do. The final straw came at my bachelorette party. Lauren had insisted on planning it, promising something elegant and memorable. She booked a wine tasting in Napa, which sounded perfect until we arrived. The other bridesmaids quickly realized Lauren had structured the entire day around stories of her own failed marriage. Every vineyard came with an anecdote about visiting with Richard. Every wine reminded her of their anniversary trips. By the time we reached the third winery, my friend Sarah pulled me aside and asked if we could manufacture an emergency and leave. But I stayed watching Lauren transform what should have been my celebration into her therapy session. And I started to understand that she wasn't going to let me have this wedding without trying to poison it somehow. The rehearsal dinner was when I saw the mask slip completely. Lauren gave a toast that started sweet but took a turn when she mentioned how she'd always protected me from life's disappointments and hoped Daniel was prepared to take over that role. She talked about how some people are just naturally lucky in love, while others have to learn harder lessons. She ended by saying she hoped my marriage would last longer than hers did, which made the room go silent for just a moment before people awkwardly raised their glasses. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that we'd get through tomorrow, and then set some serious boundaries. I agreed, not knowing that tomorrow would bring boundaries I never imagined needing. The morning of October 15th started the way all perfect days should, with sunlight streaming through the suite windows, and room service arriving with fresh fruit and pastries. The Fairmont had given us the penthouse suite for preparations, with its Art Deco mirrors and views stretching from the Bay Bridge to the Pacific. My bridesmaids arrived at 8 sharp, carrying coffee and excitement that filled the room like perfume. Sarah, my med school friend turned emergency physician, took charge of the schedule. Emma brought her speaker and created a playlist of songs from our college days. My childhood friend Maria started setting up the makeup station, while Jessica and Amy arranged the flowers that had just been delivered. The suite hummed with controlled chaos. My wedding dress hung against the window, catching the light in a way that made the pearls look like drops of morning dew. The photographer arrived at 9, beginning with detail shots of my grandmother's pearl necklace, the blue garter Daniel's mother had worn at her own wedding, and the new diamond earrings my parents had given me the night before. Mom arrived with a bottle of champagne from the year Daniel and I met, saying we'd toast with it before the ceremony. The hairstylist began working her magic, creating an updo that was somehow both elaborate and effortless, with small white orchids woven through the design. Lauren arrived at 10:30, 90 minutes late. She walked in carrying a garment bag and a tote that clinked with bottles, her expression tight with something I couldn't quite read. While the other bridesmaids had been texting all morning with updates and arrival times, Lauren had been silent. She apologized for the delay, claiming traffic from Marin, though we all knew Saturday morning traffic moved freely in that direction. She set her things down and surveyed the room like she was calculating something, her eyes lingering on each detail before settling on me. My makeup artist was just starting on my eyes when Lauren announced she needed to talk to me privately. The room was full of people, the schedule was tight, and I was finally relaxing into the day. I suggested we talk while I was getting ready, but she insisted it was important. Sarah caught my eye in the mirror and subtly shook her head, but I didn't want drama on my wedding day. I told the makeup artist I'd be right back and followed Lauren into the bedroom area of the suite. Lauren closed the door and turned to face me with an expression I'd seen before, usually right before she said something designed to hurt. She started talking about how beautiful everything looked, how perfect the weather was, how happy Mom and Dad seemed. Then she paused and said she'd been doing a lot of thinking about family and loyalty and the things we do for the people we love. She said watching me plan this wedding had brought up so many feelings about her own marriage, her own failures, her own losses. For a moment, I thought she was actually going to apologize for her behavior over the past few months. Instead, she pulled out a bottle of champagne from her tote, already uncorked, and 2 glasses. She said she wanted us to have a private toast, just sisters, before the craziness really began. She poured 2 glasses, handed me one, and raised her. Looking back, I should have noticed her hand was shaking slightly. I should have wondered why the champagne was already open. I should have questioned why she watched so intently as I brought the glass to my lips. The toast she made was actually beautiful. She talked about watching me grow from a stubborn little girl who insisted on wearing her Halloween costume to school in January to a successful woman who knew exactly what she wanted from life. She mentioned how proud she was that I'd found someone who saw my worth, who celebrated my achievements instead of competing with them. She said she hoped my wedding day would be everything I dreamed, and that my marriage would be filled with the kind of love that makes everything else fade into background noise. Then she clinked my glass and said to drink it all for good luck. The champagne tasted slightly bitter, but champagne often does when you're not really in the mood for it. I drank about half the glass before setting it down, eager to get back to preparations. Lauren seemed disappointed I hadn't finished it, pushing the glass back toward me and saying it was bad luck not to finish a toast on your wedding day. I took another sip to appease her, then said I really needed to get back to makeup. She hugged me, then longer and tighter than felt natural, and whispered that she hoped I remembered this moment forever. Walking back to the makeup chair, I felt the first wave of something wrong. It was subtle, like the world had shifted slightly off its axis. The makeup artist resumed working on my eyes, chatting about how she'd done makeup for 300 weddings, and mine was definitely in the top 10 for organization. I tried to focus on her words, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. 15 minutes passed, and the feeling intensified. The room felt warmer, the lights seemed brighter, and my thoughts were taking longer to form. Sarah noticed first. She was helping me into my dress when she stopped and looked at my face closely. As an emergency physician, she had that ability to assess someone's condition in seconds. She asked if I felt okay if I'd eaten breakfast if I was anxious about the ceremony. I told her about the slight dizziness, the feeling of disconnection, and she immediately went into doctor mode. She checked my pulse, looked at my pupils, and asked exactly what I'd had to drink that morning. When I mentioned the champagne with Lauren, Sarah's expression changed. She glanced over at Lauren, who was across the room getting dressed, then back at me. She asked if the champagne tasted normal, if Lauren had drunk from her own glass, if I'd seen where the bottle came from. The questions made the truth crystallize in my mind, like ice forming on glass. I looked at Sarah and whispered what we were both thinking. Lauren had put something in my drink. The next few minutes were a careful dance of crisis management. Sarah quietly called her boyfriend, also a doctor, who was already at the venue. She described my symptoms in medical terms I didn't fully understand, and he agreed it sounded like a benzodiazepine, probably Xanax or Valium, enough to impair, but not enough to be dangerous. Sarah made me drink 2 full bottles of water and eat some crackers from the catering tray. She stayed by my side as the hairstylist added the final touches, ready to catch me if I swayed. I had a choice to make. I could confront Lauren, call the police, cancel the wedding, and turn this into the kind of scene that would define my life forever. Or I could do something else. As the fog in my brain slowly cleared thanks to the water and food, a different plan formed. Lauren had tried to sabotage my wedding in the cruelest way possible, wanting me to stumble through my vows, to look drunk in my photos, to have my perfect day ruined by her poisonous jealousy. But she'd miscalculated. She'd given me just enough proof of her true nature and the perfect stage to reveal it. I pulled Sarah aside and told her my plan. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind at first, then slowly smiled. She said it was either the most brilliant or most insane thing she'd ever heard, but she'd support whatever I decided. I asked her to spread the word quietly to the other bridesmaids, to keep an eye on Lauren, to make sure she stayed for the reception, and most importantly, to have their phones ready to record when the time came. The wedding coordinator knocked on the door at noon, announcing it was time to line up for photos before the ceremony. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, my dress flowing around me like liquid silk. the cathedral veil my mother had worn at her own wedding secured with pearl pins. Despite everything coursing through my system, or maybe because of it, I felt strangely calm. The initial panic had transformed into something else, determination mixed with a clarity that made every detail sharper. I was going to walk down that aisle, marry the man I loved, and then give my sister exactly what she deserved. The photographer positioned us for the getting ready shots, capturing moments that would later tell a story within a story. There's one photo I still look at sometimes, where Lauren is adjusting my veil while I stare directly at the camera. My expression is serene, almost unnaturally so, while Lauren's face shows concentration mixed with something else. Looking at it now, knowing what I knew, then you can see the calculation in her eyes, the satisfaction she thought she was hiding. She believed she'd won something accomplished, some twisted goal that made sense in whatever dark corner of her mind had planned this. My father arrived for our first look, and the emotion on his face almost broke my composure. He'd been saving for my wedding since I was 5 years old, putting away $50 every month into what he called the Princess Fund. Seeing his youngest daughter in her wedding dress, he started crying before saying a word. He told me I looked exactly like my mother had 40 years ago, radiant and strong and ready to take on the world. When he hugged me, I breathed in his familiar cologne and felt 5 years old again, safe and protected and loved unconditionally. I wanted to tell him what Lauren had done to let him fix it the way he'd fixed scraped knees and broken toys. But this wasn't his battle to fight. Sarah stayed close as we made our way to the ceremony space, her hand occasionally steadying my elbow when the world tilted slightly. The effects were manageable, now dulled by water and adrenaline and sheer will. She'd done the math on the timing and figured Lauren had given me enough to last through the ceremony and into the reception, probably hoping I'd appear increasingly intoxicated as the night wore on. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. In front of our grandparents, our parents' friends, Daniel's conservative Boston relatives, I was supposed to look like a drunk bride who couldn't handle her wedding day. The music started box air on G-string floating through the afternoon air. The ceremony space was transformed into a garden paradise with white roses and baby's breath creating an aisle that seemed to lead straight to heaven. Our 300 guests rose as the wedding party began their procession. I watched through the window as my bridesmaids walked one by one, their rose gold dresses catching the light like sunset on water. Lauren went last right before me, and I saw her pause at the altar to scan the crowd, probably imagining their reactions, when I stumbled my way through the ceremony. The wedding coordinator squeezed my hand and told me to breathe. The music changed to Pachelbel's canon, our cue to begin. My father offered his arm, and we stepped into view. 300 faces turned toward us, and I felt their collective intake of breath. Later, people would tell me I looked like I was floating, that there was something ethereal about the way I moved down that aisle. They had no idea it was partly because I was concentrating on every single step, refusing to let the chemicals in my system steal this moment from me. Daniel's face when he saw me was worth everything. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide, and his smile was so genuine, so full of love, that for a moment I forgot about Lauren, forgot about the poison, forgot about everything except the man waiting for me at the altar. His best man, James, handed him a handkerchief, and the gesture was so sweetly prepared that several people in the audience laughed softly. This was real. This was mine. This was what Lauren would never be able to touch no matter what she put in my drink. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of carefully managed moments. When the officiant asked who gave this woman to be married, my father's voice was strong and clear. When Daniel took my hands for the vows, I felt the tremor in them and squeezed to let him know I was okay. His vows were everything I'd expected, and more promising not just to love and cherish, but to build a life of adventure and meaning together. He talked about our first meeting, our first fight, our first reconciliation. He promised to support my dreams even when they scared him to dance with me in the kitchen, while dinner burned, to always save the last bite of dessert for me. My vows were when I almost lost it, not from the drugs, but from emotion. Looking into Daniel's eyes, I talked about finding home in a person rather than a place. I promised to be his biggest cheerleader and gentlest critic to adventure with him, to places unknown, and also to find magic in ordinary Tuesday nights. I promised to love him through successes and failures, through youth and age, through whatever storms or sunshine life brought our way. My voice stayed steady even as tears ran down my face, and I heard sniffles from the audience that told me I wasn't crying alone. Lauren stood behind me the entire time, holding my bouquet, playing the part of supportive sister. I could feel her presence like a shadow waiting for me to stumble over words or sway on my feet. During the ring exchange, when I had to turn slightly to take Daniel's ring from her, our eyes met. She was searching my face for signs of impairment, and I gave her the smallest smile, just enough to confuse her. Let her wonder why her plan wasn't working the way she'd imagined. The kiss was perfect, exactly long enough to be romantic, without being inappropriate for the mixed company. The officiant presented us as husband and wife, and the crowd erupted in applause that felt like summer rain washing away everything except joy. Daniel and I practically ran back down the aisle laughing like children who'd gotten away with something wonderful. Behind us, the wedding party followed, and I knew Lauren was among them, probably already recalculating, trying to figure out her next move. In the brief moment we had alone, before photos, Daniel held my face in his hands and asked if I was really okay. He'd noticed something during the ceremony, the way someone who knows you completely can sense when you're fighting to maintain control. I told him I'd explain everything later, but that everything was going to be perfect. He trusted me enough not to push, instead pulling me into a kiss that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. The photo session was its own kind of performance. The photographer positioned us in various combinations, just the couple with the wedding party, with families, with college friends. Lauren had to stand next to me in dozens of shots, smiling like the proud sister she was pretending to be. In the photos with just the two of us requested by our mother, she put her arm around me and whispered, asking if I felt okay, if I needed to sit down, if maybe we should take a break. I told her I'd never felt better in my life, which wasn't entirely a lie. The truth was settling into my bones like calcium, making me stronger with every passing minute. Sarah managed to pull me aside during a transition between photo locations. She'd been watching Lauren, who was growing increasingly agitated as I continued to function normally. The original plan had probably been for me to be obviously impaired by now slurring words or needing support to stand. Instead, I was laughing with guests, posing for photos, being the bride I was supposed to be. Sarah said Lauren had been drinking steadily from a flask in her purse, probably needing liquid courage for whatever she planned next. The cocktail hour was when I finalized my plan. While Daniel and I mingled with guests, accepting congratulations and compliments, I found our MC Daniel's friend Marcus, who did stand-up comedy on weekends. I told him I wanted to do something special for the toast to have Lauren go last because she'd put so much work into her speech. Marcus, who'd witnessed Lauren's behavior at the rehearsal dinner, raised an eyebrow but agreed. I also found the videographer and asked him to make sure he captured every moment of the toast, especially the last one. He promised to set up multiple angles for the best coverage. My next stop was unexpected but necessary. Among our guests was Jennifer Walsh, a family friend who also happened to be one of the best criminal defense attorneys in California. I found her at the bar and asked if I could speak with her privately for just a moment. In the corner of the cocktail space with the Golden Gate Bridge glittering behind us, I told her what had happened. Her expression went from confusion to anger to professional assessment in the span of seconds. She asked if I wanted to press charges, and I told her I wanted to wait and see how the evening played out first. She said she'd stay close and gave me her cell number, telling me to call immediately if I felt worse. The final piece was Daniel. I couldn't let him be blindsided by what was coming. During the brief break before we entered the reception, I told him everything. His first instinct was to find Lauren and physically remove her from the premises. His second was to call the police. But when I explained what I wanted to do, he looked at me with a mixture of awe and concern. He asked if I was sure if this wasn't the drugs talking, if I really wanted our wedding reception to become this kind of spectacle. I told him Lauren had already made it a spectacle by poisoning the bride. Now we were just choosing the ending. The reception ballroom took my breath away, even through the lingering haze of whatever Lauren had given me. 30 round tables dressed in ivory linens with gold chargers, centerpieces of white orchids and roses reaching toward the coffered ceiling, and thousands of tiny lights creating a constellation effect above the dance floor. The 12-piece band was already playing jazz standards as guests found their seats, and the energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Daniel and I waited outside the main doors, while Marcus prepared our entrance, and I took those final moments to center myself for what was coming. Our entrance song was Lovely Day by Bill Withers, and we danced our way to the head table while 300 people cheered and raised their champagne glasses. The pure joy on most faces stood in stark contrast to Lauren's forced smile at the wedding party table. She was seated between two of my bridesmaids, Sarah on one side, keeping careful watch Jessica on the other, ready to intervene if needed. I'd assembled my own security team without Lauren realizing it, women who loved me enough to help me handle this situation my way. Dinner service began with a butternut squash soup that had guests murmuring appreciation. I managed to eat most of mine knowing I needed food to counteract both the drugs and the adrenaline coursing through my system. Daniel kept his hand on my knee under the table, a steady pressure reminding me I wasn't alone in this. We'd been married exactly 2 hours, and already we were facing our first crisis together. The fact that he was letting me handle it my way, supporting my decision, even though it went against every protective instinct, he had made me love him even more. Lauren was drinking heavily now, wine with dinner and champagne between courses. I watched her from my peripheral vision as she reviewed her speech notes, crossing things out and adding others. She'd probably prepared something that walked the line between appropriate and cruel, but the alcohol was likely pushing her toward less subtle territory. Perfect. The more honest she became, the better this would work. The parent dances came after the main course. My father and I swayed to The Way You Look Tonight, while he whispered how proud he was, how beautiful I looked, how happy he was that I'd found Daniel. Dancing with him, feeling safe in his arms, I almost broke down and told him everything. But then I caught sight of Lauren downing another glass of champagne, and I remembered why I needed to do this my way. My father had protected me my whole life, but this was my battle to win. Marcus began the toast after dessert was served, starting with Daniel's parents. His father, a retired federal judge, spoke eloquently about the nature of commitment and partnership. His mother told embarrassing stories about Daniel as a child that had everyone laughing, including him. My parents went next, tag-teaming a speech about watching their daughter find her perfect match. They talked about how Daniel had won them over, not with grand gestures, but with consistent kindness, with the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. The wedding party speeches followed a predictable pattern of inside jokes, college stories, and heartfelt wishes for our future. James, Daniel's best man, killed with a story about Daniel practicing his proposal speech on him so many times that James could recite it himself. Sarah gave a beautiful speech about friendship and finding your person, managing to make everyone cry without revealing the drama she was helping me navigate. The other bridesmaids shared memories and wishes, each one building the warm, loving atmosphere that would make what came next even more shocking. Finally, Marcus announced it was time for the maid of honor speech. He gave Lauren a glowing introduction that I'd written for him, talking about the special bond between sisters and how much her support had meant during the wedding planning. The room applauded as Lauren stood swaying slightly and made her way to the microphone. I saw several people exchange glances, noticing her unsteady gait, probably assuming she was just emotional or had celebrated a bit too much. Lauren took the microphone and stood there for a moment, scanning the room. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before she began. Her opening was actually beautiful, talking about watching me take my first steps, teaching me to ride a bike, protecting me from bullies in elementary school. She told the story of when I was 6 and insisted on wearing her high school graduation cap, to my own kindergarten graduation, wanting to be just like my big sister. The audience was charmed, relaxing into what seemed like a loving tribute. The shift was subtle at first. Lauren started talking about how some people are born lucky, blessed with advantages others have to fight for. She mentioned how I'd always had things come easily to me, good grades without studying as hard as she did, friends without trying as hard as she did, and now love without suffering as much as she did. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a degree as people realized this wasn't going where they'd expected. She continued, her words becoming sharper with each sentence. She talked about fairness, about cosmic balance, about how sometimes the universe needs help making things even. She mentioned her own failed marriage, how her husband had betrayed her while I got to stand there in my perfect dress with my perfect husband, starting my perfect life. The alcohol had stripped away her filter, and years of resentment came pouring out in front of everyone who mattered to both of us. Daniel started to stand ready to intervene, but I put my hand on his arm. This was exactly what I'd wanted Lauren revealing herself without any prompting from me. Several of our relatives looked horrified, and I saw my mother starting to rise from her seat. But Lauren wasn't done. She raised her champagne glass and said she wanted to toast to balance to justice, to making sure everyone got what they deserved. Then she said it, the words that changed everything. She looked directly at me and said she hoped I was enjoying the special wedding gift she'd given me that morning, the one designed to make sure I experienced my wedding day, the way she'd experienced hers through a haze of confusion and disorientation. She actually smiled as she said it, proud of her cleverness, sure that everyone would understand and even approve of what she'd done. The silence that followed was complete. 300 people sat frozen, processing what they'd just heard. Lauren seemed to realize something was wrong, that the reaction wasn't what she'd expected, but the alcohol and adrenaline pushed her forward. She started actually explaining how she'd put something in my champagne to level the playing field to make sure I didn't get to have the perfect day she'd been denied. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress, and walked to where Marcus stood with a second microphone. My voice was steady when I spoke, though my hands were shaking. I thanked Lauren for her honesty, for finally showing everyone who she really was. I confirmed that yes, she had drugged me on my wedding day, and yes, I'd known for hours, and yes, I'd chosen to let her speak anyway, because I believed people should know the truth about the family they were part of. Jennifer Walsh stood up from her table and walked forward, introducing herself as a criminal defense attorney, and stating for the record that she'd witnessed a confession to assault. She advised Lauren that drugging someone without their consent was a felony, and suggested she might want to stop talking immediately. The security guards from the hotel, who'd been discreetly alerted by the wedding coordinator, appeared at the ballroom entrances. Lauren's face went through a series of transformations as she realized what had happened. The microphone fell from her hand, creating a feedback shriek that seemed to break the spell. People started talking all at once, voices rising in shock and anger. My father was on his feet, moving toward Lauren with an expression I'd never seen before. My mother was crying, whether from embarrassment or rage, I couldn't tell. Daniel's parents looked stunned, probably wondering what kind of family their son had married into. But the most interesting reaction came from my grandmother, my father's mother, who simply nodded as if a suspicion had been confirmed. She would tell me later that she'd always sensed something dark in Lauren, a jealousy that ran deeper than sibling rivalry. She'd tried to warn my parents years ago, but had been dismissed as playing favorites. Now, in front of everyone, she'd been vindicated. Lauren tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The security guards weren't restraining her, but they were blocking the exits. She turned back to face the room, mascara running down her face, and tried to explain again. She talked about how unfair life had been to her, how I'd stolen everything, how she just wanted me to understand what it felt like to have your special day ruined. The more she talked, the worse it got, each word another nail in the coffin of our relationship. The immediate aftermath was chaos carefully managed. Jennifer Walsh took charge, instructing the security guards to escort Lauren to a separate room, while we decided how to proceed. She went with them along with my parents and Daniel's father, whose judicial background suddenly proved invaluable. The band, showing remarkable professionalism, began playing soft jazz to fill the stunned silence. Marcus grabbed the microphone and suggested everyone refresh their drinks while we sorted through some family business, his comedy training helping him navigate the impossibly awkward moment. Daniel and I stood in the center of the storm, holding each other while guests approached in waves. Some offered sympathy, others outrage on our behalf, and a few shared their own stories of toxic siblings who'd tried to ruin important moments. My college roommate admitted her brother had shown up drunk to her engagement party and proposed to his ex-girlfriend using her celebration as a stage. Daniel's aunt revealed her sister had worn a white dress to her wedding 30 years ago, and she still hadn't forgiven her. Apparently, Lauren's behavior, while extreme, wasn't entirely unique in the annals of sibling rivalry. Sarah had already contacted the hospital to run official toxicology tests later, ensuring we'd have medical documentation if needed. She'd also been monitoring my vitals throughout the evening, making sure the dose wasn't dangerous. According to her calculations, Lauren had used enough Xanax to make me noticeably impaired, but not enough to require medical intervention. It was a calculated dose, which made it worse somehow. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment, but a planned attack with carefully measured malice. My mother returned to the ballroom looking like she'd aged 5 years in 20 minutes. She pulled me aside and apologized through tears, saying she'd pushed me to include Lauren because she'd believed family should always come together. She'd ignored the warning signs, the escalating jealousy, the cruel comments disguised as jokes. She'd wanted so badly to have both her daughters happy that she'd refused to see one of them was incapable of happiness that didn't come at someone else's expense. My father's reaction was different. He was cold furious in a way that manifested as icy control rather than hot anger. He informed me that Lauren would be leaving immediately and would not be welcome at any future family gatherings until she got serious psychological help. He'd already arranged for her car to be brought around and had given her exactly 5 minutes to leave before he'd reconsider pressing charges. The man who'd never raised his voice in my entire childhood had apparently found his limit. Jennifer Walsh returned with a proposal. We could press charges, and Lauren would likely face arrest and prosecution for assault. Or we could document everything, have Lauren sign an admission of guilt, and use it as leverage to ensure she stayed away and got treatment. The criminal justice system would be slow and public, turning our wedding into a prolonged legal battle. The alternative would give us control over the narrative and the consequences. Daniel and I looked at each other and made the decision together. We chose documentation over prosecution, peace over punishment. Lauren signed everything Jennifer put in front of her, her hand shaking so badly the signatures were barely legible. She admitted to drugging me, agreed to seek psychiatric treatment, and accepted a restraining order that would keep her away from Daniel and me for at least 2 years. She looked at me once during the process, and in her eyes I saw not remorse but rage that her plan had failed. Even then, even after everything, she was still the victim in her own story. As security escorted Lauren out through the service entrance, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I returned to the ballroom and asked Marcus for the microphone. The room fell silent as I stood before our guests, still in my wedding dress, still wearing my grandmother's pearls, still technically drugged by my own sister. I thanked everyone for their support and understanding, acknowledged that they'd witnessed something unprecedented, and then said something that shifted the entire energy of the room. I announced that we had a choice. We could let Lauren's actions define this night, or we could choose to make it about love, conquering dysfunction, about choosing joy despite someone's attempt to steal it. I said that everyone in that room had probably faced someone who tried to dim their light, and tonight we were going to shine anyway. The band was still here. The dance floor was still beautiful. And I was still married to the most wonderful man I'd ever met. So we were going to dance. Daniel joined me for our first dance, which we'd never gotten to do properly. The band played At Last by Etta James, and as we swayed together, the room seemed to exhale collectively. One by one, other couples joined us on the dance floor. My parents danced together, holding each other like they were reassuring themselves their family was still intact. Friends who'd been shocked into silence were now laughing and taking selfies. The photographer who'd captured everything, including Lauren's confession, was now getting shots of genuine celebration. The rest of the reception became legendary for different reasons than Lauren's meltdown. It became the wedding where love won, where people chose celebration over scandal, where 300 guests formed a protective circle around a couple who'd been attacked on what should have been their happiest day. The band played an extra hour for free because they said they'd never seen anything like it. The hotel comped our champagne toast because they felt responsible for letting Lauren near the drinks. Even the vendors who heard what happened sent notes afterward, expressing admiration for how we'd handled it. By midnight, when we finally left in a shower of rose petals and well wishes, the story had already begun spreading beyond our guests. Someone's plus one was apparently a journalist who live-tweeted the entire event, and by morning, we'd become viral. The hashtag #ToxicSisterWedding was trending with thousands of people sharing their own stories of family members who'd tried to sabotage important moments. We became accidental symbols of resilience, though all we'd really done was refuse to let Lauren's poison define our beginning. Daniel and I spent our wedding night at the St. Regis, in a suite overlooking the city where we'd met, fallen in love, and now started our marriage. We ordered room service at 2 in the morning and finally ate properly for the first time all day. We talked through everything that had happened, processing the surreal turn our wedding had taken. Daniel admitted he'd been terrified when he realized I was drugged, but watching me handle it with such grace had made him fall in love with me all over again. I told him that knowing he supported my decision to let Lauren expose herself, even though every instinct probably screamed to protect me, showed me exactly the kind of partner I'd married. Our honeymoon in Maui should have been an escape from the chaos, but the internet had other plans. The story of the wedding had gone completely viral, with news outlets picking it up and running headlines like, "Bride let sister confess to drugging her in front of 300 wedding guests," and "The ultimate wedding revenge letting someone destroy themselves." My phone was flooded with interview requests, book deal offers, and messages from strangers who either praised my restraint or criticized me for not pressing charges immediately. Daniel and I made the decision to turn off our phones and focus on each other, letting the digital storm rage without us. The hotel staff in Maui had seen the news and treated us like celebrities who needed protection. They upgraded us to a private villa, arranged dinners on secluded beaches, and made sure no other guests bothered us with questions. It was during a sunset walk on Wailea Beach that the magnitude of what had happened finally hit me. I broke down crying, not from sadness, but from the release of tension I'd been carrying since the moment I realized my own sister had poisoned me. Daniel held me while I sobbed, letting years of suppressed frustration about Lauren's behavior flow out with the tears. We returned home after 2 weeks to find our lives had changed in unexpected ways. There were flowers on our doorstep from strangers who'd been inspired by our story. My company had fielded dozens of media requests and was giving me time to decide how to handle them. Daniel's architecture firm had actually gained several new clients who'd heard about the wedding and wanted to work with people who clearly had strong values. Even the vendors from our wedding were seeing increased business from people who wanted to work with the team that had handled the wedding of the century. The toxicology report came back confirming what Sarah had suspected. Lauren had given me approximately 4 milligrams of alprazolam, commonly known as Xanax. It was enough to cause significant impairment in someone who didn't regularly take the medication, but not enough to be life-threatening. The precision of the dose suggested she'd researched it carefully, walking the line between causing visible impairment and actual danger. Jennifer Walsh said this premeditation would have actually made the criminal charges worse if we'd chosen to pursue them. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a letter from Lauren. It was postmarked from Arizona, where she'd apparently gone to stay with a college friend. The letter was 10 pages of justification, blame, and victim narrative. She wrote about how I'd always been the favorite, how our parents had given me opportunities they'd denied her, how my success had come at the expense of hers. She claimed the drugging was a moment of temporary insanity, brought on by the stress of her divorce, and watching me have everything she'd lost. Not once in 10 pages did she actually apologize or acknowledge the harm she'd caused. I showed the letter to my therapist, whom I'd started seeing to process everything. She helped me understand that Lauren's behavior was likely rooted in a personality disorder that prevented her from taking responsibility for her actions. Everything would always be someone else's fault in Lauren's world. The therapist also helped me work through the guilt I felt about the public humiliation Lauren had faced, reminding me that I hadn't forced her to drug me or confess it to 300 people. Those were her choices, and she had to live with the consequences. My parents were struggling in their own ways. My mother joined a support group for parents of adult children with toxic behaviors, learning that she wasn't alone in having one child who seemed determined to destroy family harmony. My father threw himself into research about sibling rivalry and narcissistic personality disorder, trying to understand how he'd missed the signs. They both started their own therapy, working through the guilt of having enabled Lauren's behavior for so many years by insisting on family unity above all else. Daniel and I settled into married life with a story that was certainly unique. Every dinner party eventually led to someone asking about the wedding, and we developed a shortened version that hit the highlights without dwelling on the pain. We learned to laugh about certain aspects, like how the photographer had won an award for his coverage of the event, calling it the most dramatic wedding photography of his career. Or how the hotel had added a new policy about bridesmaids and groomsmen not being allowed near the bride's drinks without supervision. 6 months after the wedding, we received word through Jennifer that Lauren was in a residential treatment program in Nevada. She'd apparently had another breakdown after losing her job. When the law firm discovered what she'd done at our wedding, rock bottom for Lauren, involved an arrest for public intoxication and a court-mandated psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation revealed what we'd suspected: narcissistic personality disorder, with antisocial features. The treatment program was designed for people with personality disorders and would last at least a year. Our first anniversary approached with its own weight of memory and meaning. Daniel suggested we have a small celebration with just our closest friends, the ones who'd helped us through the wedding chaos. Instead, I had a different idea. We threw a massive party inviting everyone who'd been at the wedding except Lauren. We called it our drama-free anniversary and made it clear this was about celebrating our marriage, not rehashing the past. The dress code was casual, the atmosphere was relaxed, and the only toast came from Daniel and me, thanking everyone for their support. The anniversary party was everything our wedding reception should have been: pure joy, without underlying tension. People danced without scandal, laughed without nervousness, and celebrated without waiting for another shoe to drop. My parents looked lighter, freed from the burden of managing Lauren's emotions at family events. Friends who'd been too shocked to properly celebrate at the wedding were now able to fully embrace the happiness of our union. Even my grandmother at 86 got on the dance floor for the electric slide. During the party, Sarah pulled me aside with news. She'd been at a medical conference where our wedding had actually become a case study in a presentation about family dynamics and substance assault. The presenter, who didn't know Sarah was connected to the event, used it as an example of how toxic family members often choose important life events to act out their psychological issues. The wedding had become teaching material for identifying and managing similar situations. We'd inadvertently contributed to psychological education. 2 years passed before I heard from Lauren again. The restraining order was about to expire, and she sent a letter through her therapist asking if I'd be willing to participate in a joint therapy session as part of her treatment. The letter was different from her previous communication, shorter, and more focused on her desire to make amends as part of her recovery process. The therapist included a note explaining that Lauren had made significant progress, but that I was under no obligation to participate if it would be harmful to my own well-being. Daniel and I discussed it extensively. He was protective, worried that seeing Lauren would undo the peace we'd built. My parents were divided, my mother hoping for reconciliation, while my father remained skeptical. My own therapist said the decision had to be mine alone, but helped me explore what I hoped to gain or lose from the meeting. After weeks of consideration, I agreed to a single session with clear boundaries and the understanding that this didn't mean resuming a relationship. The session took place in a neutral location in San Jose, halfway between San Francisco and the treatment facility. Lauren looked different, older, but also somehow softer. The aggressive edge that had always been part of her energy was muted. She started by reading from a prepared statement, acknowledging what she'd done without excuse or justification. She admitted to poisoning me out of jealousy and spite, recognized the criminal nature of her actions, and thanked me for not pressing charges, which would have resulted in her losing her law license permanently. What struck me most was what she said next. She talked about discovering in therapy that her entire identity had been built on comparison and competition. She'd never learned to value herself outside of how she measured up to others, particularly me. Every achievement I had felt like something taken from her. Every happiness I experienced felt like proof that she was undeserving. The wedding had represented the ultimate loss in her mind, the final proof that I had won at life while she had lost. Her therapist explained that Lauren's treatment had involved completely deconstructing this worldview and building a new sense of self based on internal rather than external validation. It was the hardest thing Lauren had ever done, harder than law school or her divorce. There were months where she wanted to quit, to return to the comfortable misery of blaming others for her unhappiness. But something about hitting bottom at my wedding, being exposed so completely and publicly, had finally broken through her denial. Lauren looked at me directly for the first time and said something I never expected to hear. She said she was grateful I'd let her give that toast. If I'd stopped her, had her removed quietly, or handled it privately, she might have spent the rest of her life believing she was right to drug me. The public humiliation had been unbearable, but it had also been undeniable. She couldn't rewrite the narrative when 300 people had witnessed her confession. That undeniability had been the gift that finally forced her to confront herself. I didn't forgive her in that session. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give yet, and maybe never would be. But I acknowledged her work, her effort to change, and her apology. I told her about the life Daniel and I had built, carefully avoiding details that might trigger her competitive nature. I shared that our parents were doing better, that the family had found a new equilibrium without her presence. It wasn't cruel, just honest about the peace that had come from her absence. The session ended with an understanding rather than a reconciliation. Lauren would continue her treatment and her work to build a life that wasn't defined by comparison to mine. I would continue my life with Daniel, building our family and future, without the shadow of her resentment. We might someday find a way to have some kind of relationship, but it would never be the sisterhood our mother had dreamed of. Some damage can't be undone, only acknowledged and navigated. Driving home from that session, I thought about the wedding and how differently it could have gone. If Lauren hadn't drugged me, would she have found another way to sabotage it? If I hadn't let her speak, would she have escalated to something worse? There was no way to know what other timeline might have existed. All I knew was that in this timeline, her worst action had led to her first real chance at healing, and my worst day had become the foundation of an unshakable marriage. Daniel was waiting when I got home, dinner ready and wine poured. He didn't ask for details immediately, just held me while I processed the strange experience of seeing Lauren take accountability. Later, over pasta and good Chianti, I told him everything. He listened without judgment, supporting my decision not to forgive, while also acknowledging the profound change Lauren seemed to have undergone. This was why I'd married him, this ability to hold complexity without needing simple answers. A month after the therapy session, my mother called with news. Lauren had completed her program and was starting fresh in Phoenix. She'd taken a job at a small firm doing contract law, far from the high-powered corporate work she'd done before. She was living simply, attending regular therapy, and had even started dating someone she'd met in treatment. My mother wanted to visit her to try to rebuild some kind of relationship. I told her to follow her heart, but to maintain boundaries, to remember that Lauren's recovery was still fragile and might not withstand the pressure of family dynamics. The real test came when I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled Daniel and me with joy, but also with decisions about who to tell and when. My parents were ecstatic, already planning their roles as grandparents. Friends celebrated with us, throwing a beautiful baby shower free of drama. But the question lingered. Would we tell Lauren? Would we risk triggering her competitive nature? With news of this next milestone in my life, I decided to send a simple card through her therapist, informing her that she would be an aunt, but making no demands or invitations. The response came back through the same channel, a brief congratulations and a promise to respect our boundaries. She didn't ask for photos or updates, didn't try to insert herself into the narrative. It was the most appropriate response she'd ever given to my happiness. And oddly, it gave me hope that maybe she really had changed. Our daughter was born on a rainy Thursday in December, perfect and healthy, and immediately the center of our universe. We named her Grace, not after anyone, but for the concept itself, for the grace we'd found in surviving our wedding day, for the grace required to move forward after betrayal, for the grace we hoped to teach her in navigating a complex world. As I held her for the first time, I made a promise that she would never have to compete for love, never have to earn her worth through comparison to others. The wedding video, which included Lauren's confession and my response, sat in our safe deposit box. We decided to keep it as evidence if ever needed, but also as a reminder of what we'd overcome. Sometimes the most important moments in life aren't the pretty ones, but the ones that reveal truth. Our wedding had done both, showing us the worst of family dysfunction, while also revealing the strength of our bond and the power of choosing dignity over drama. Looking back now, 3 years after that October day, I can see how Lauren's actions had inadvertently given us gifts. Not the poisoning itself, which was unforgivable, but the aftermath. Daniel and I had started our marriage having already weathered a crisis together, proving we could handle anything as a team. Our families had been forced to confront toxic patterns and make real changes. And most importantly, we'd learned that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living while loving fully and letting people face the consequences of their own choices. The question people always ask when they hear our story is whether I regret letting Lauren give that speech. They wonder if I should have just had her removed, quietly avoided the spectacle, protected our guests from such an ugly scene. But I don't regret it. In that moment, drugged and betrayed on what should have been my happiest day, I made a choice that honored truth over appearance, consequence over covering up. That choice defined not just our wedding, but our marriage. We would always choose honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was painful. Our story became part of wedding culture in unexpected ways. Venues started offering discreet security specifically for family members who might cause problems. Wedding planners added clauses to their contracts about managing toxic relatives. There was even a support group that formed online for people whose weddings had been sabotaged by family members. The hashtag that had started with our wedding became a place for people to share their stories and find solidarity in the strange, specific pain of family betrayal during celebrations. I never sought to be the poster child for dealing with toxic siblings, but somehow that's what happened. The interview requests never completely stopped, especially around wedding season when magazines wanted to run features on wedding disasters and how to handle them. I turned most of them down, but did agree to one podcast about family dynamics and mental health, using our story to highlight the importance of boundaries and the possibility of recovery for people with personality disorders. Lauren wasn't mentioned by name, and I focused on my own journey rather than her crimes. The lasting legacy of our wedding isn't the drama, but the love that survived it. Every anniversary, Daniel and I toast with champagne, the same brand Lauren had poisoned, reclaiming it as ours. We tell Grace age-appropriate stories about our wedding, focusing on how many people loved us and celebrated with us, saving the darker truths for when she's older. We've built a life full of normal problems and regular joys, remarkable only in its deliberate pursuit of peace. Sometimes I dream about an alternate universe where Lauren and I are close, where she stood beside me at my wedding with genuine happiness, where family gatherings aren't minefields of careful navigation. But that's not our story. Our story is messier, more painful, but also more honest. It's about choosing to celebrate even when someone tries to steal your joy. It's about letting truth reveal itself rather than forcing confrontation. It's about learning that family isn't about blood, but about who shows up with love instead of poison. Do I wish my wedding day had gone differently? Of course. Do I wish my sister hadn't drugged me in a twisted attempt to ruin my happiness? Absolutely. But if I could go back knowing what would happen, would I change how I handled it? No. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to destroy you is simply step back and let them reveal who they really are. Lauren gave me a poisoned toast, but in the end, she was the only one who had to drink it. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have called the police immediately? Had her removed quietly? Or would you have done what I did, letting the truth come out in its own devastating way? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences with family members who couldn't let you have your moment. If you've made it this far in our story, please consider subscribing for more real-life stories about navigating complex relationships and finding grace under pressure. Like this video if you believe in the power of truth, and share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember, the best response to someone's attempt to dim your light is to shine even brighter.